Okay, so this is the study guide audio for exam 2, gender. Okay, so the first one is misplaced nostalgia. Just this idea that people have this kind of idealized notion of the 1950s that really is largely coming from media influences and not from a reflection of the reality of the American family at the time period, right? Let's see. Family values versus feminism. Just that there's a lot of these debates between, family values, basically saying that if you support families, then you don't support feminism, right? Kind of conflating family values, which is really ridiculous, right? Because obviously feminists also have family values. They want families to have paid family leave, right? That seems to be a value. But typically the way that we understand family values is just encouraging traditional gender roles. This idea of a woman staying at home is family values. A woman, not being the breadwinner or not making the decisions in the household, the man being the man of the castle or man of the house or whatever, is kind of tied to these values, right? It really encourages that separate spheres ideology, that there's a world for men and a world for women and they're separate. So it really argues that if women go to work or school or even like run for office or play sports, somehow that's going to destroy the family as a social institution, right? So that's really the family values issue there. Economic changes, just that it's changed work and the status of men and women. So, this means that, traditionally, this is kind of that time period where people went from working, on a farm or in their home to working in outside labor, right? And this really changed the status of men and women because, all of this industrialized work that men, or basically men's work, like let's say you're working on the farm, but then you now have a device that you can basically harvest instead of by hand with a machine, right? That's obviously going to limit the amount of manpower or hours that are needed. So that kind of freed up people's labor to be able to move into these, industrial economy aspects. And so of course, their work was industrialized mostly for men. So therefore, a lot of this technology took over the stuff that people had done before that. And it kind of made it so that women's work was now what was left over as the domestic roles of the house. Cultural definition of marriage. Just this idea that in our culture, we think that marriage is about trapping a man, right? That men don't want to get married, that women do want to get married. And we have this kind of societal mythology, which doesn't actually represent the reality of relationships that are much more complex than that, right? There's plenty of men that want to get married. There's plenty of women that don't. And it essentializes one way as the way, which, causes problems for people. Let's see, children and happiness. Just that couples that are married with children tend to have lower satisfaction than couples without children, and that there's certain stages of the child's life in which marital happiness drops. So like when they're first born, when they go to school, and of course when they're teenagers, because who wants a teenager in their house? Nobody. Let's see, children learn gendered expectations, just that we learn from our families, different roles for men and women. So the example that I'm giving here is just the idea that, what we talked about in class, that chores tend to be very gendered, right? And they tend to reflect the adult roles of men work outside the house, women work inside the house kind of ideas. And of course, that could be different depending on your family because your family is who teaches you these values. But the idea that we're learning gendered expectations from our families and how we act, how we behave, and what roles we're supposed to inhabit. The problem of daycare, just that it's crazy expensive, right? And so poor families especially, but also middle-class families are really struggling to pay for daycare. And it's because parents need a place to drop off their kid so they can go to work, right? Because we don't have work policies that offer flex time or daycare facilities within some, workplaces, which is the case for some people. Like if you're a student of Cal State Fullerton or if you're, a faculty, there are childcare services on campus, right? And those things are very helpful for people that then don't have to, it's easier to navigate having a family and a career when you don't have to choose between one or the other or put a lot of priority and focus on one and not the other. So it gives people more balance, right? But anyway, obviously, also we talked about the idea that the cost of daycare is like as expensive as it is to go to a university at this point, which is insane. Okay, babies having babies. Just the fact that the teen pregnancy rate or the teen birth rate in this country has dropped dramatically since the 90s, but we're still basically, we're still at a rate that's much higher than other nations that have been developed, right? Problem of fatherlessness, that this isn't necessarily people just trying to, give up their parental responsibilities, that a large part of this is the structural forces that are at play, right? So, meaning if you're going to inhabit the role of like the man of the house or the father figure or those kind of, roles, that typically comes with expectations of being a breadwinner, right? And what if you're unemployed or poor? What if you don't have, what if you just don't have good educational opportunities that lead to better, job opportunities? So, these structural problems really make it difficult, right? Especially because men's ability to get jobs has really been waning in recent years, right? You have a lot more men facing unemployment. You have male industries that are often being offshored, like factory labor and things of that nature. So, as a result, that's part of the reason why men are not in their children's lives. I mean, obviously, there's individual choices, right? There's those things, but that's not really what we're looking at through a structural aspect, right? That's like the sociological imagination. Everyone makes their individual choices in what they do. But when you're looking at the structure, you really have to look at how there's outside forces that shape what opportunities you have. So if you don't have opportunity for good employment, or if you have, just the idea that you have to work so many hours just to get like a basic standard of living, it's going to affect your, likelihood of being involved in your children's lives. Let's see, gay and lesbian families. Just the idea that like same-sex marriage has expanded the definition of marriage, but it's not as if the the institution of marriage has now destroyed the way that people said it would be, or somehow radically altered, right? There's still pretty actually heteronormative expectations in regards to marriage, right? And even this, we can see this with same-sex couples where people will say, well, who's going to wear the dress, right? Or, who wears the pants, those kind of things, where you're like, well, kind of the whole point is that you're in a same-sex relationship. So this idea of like, who is the heterosexual equivalent is obviously stupid. Okay, let's see. At-home fathers. Here, just this idea that stay-at-home fathers are judged more harshly than stay-at-home mothers, because they're challenging that traditional gender role that says that women are the ones that are supposed to be taking care of kids, right? And really, they're challenging this idea that men are much better suited for the world of work, as their wives are the ones inhabiting that role. So it really challenges that masculine identity, because we really tie men to what they do for a living. For better or worse, we really judge them based on these kind of things. Reversing. So reversing, these all came from the chapter, just indicates the performance of non-traditional homemaking and money-making tasks. Conflicting were the couples that described different meanings for the performances of work and family they had, meaning that often in those families, the conflicting ones, men stayed home because they either got paid less or it was just easier for them to stay home, not because, they were purposely switching gender role expectations like the reversing couples. Collaborating ones, couples, indicated that these couples are basically trying to find different meanings. Basically, again, they know that they're living in a system that has gendered expectations, right? Like they're aware of that. So as a result, they try to kind of deal with that by really just transgressing the expectations of what's considered. So they collaborate, they share the housework, the child rearing, those kind of things. And it's really kind of through a focus on gender, right? Versus improvising. This is just basically when you're using, you're choosing who stays home or who whatever, but you're not doing it through the lens of gender, right? That's not the consideration of, oh, you're a woman, so you should stay home, or, oh, this kind of expectations of staying home, that we will switch the roles of male and female or anything like that. They're really not thinking about gender. Of course, they are challenging gendered assumptions by just what they're doing. So the improvising one is just really about not using gender as the measure for who does what, just figuring it out, improvising, just working it out, right? And that challenges traditional gendered assumptions because it's just about working as a unit, right? And not as an individual. And then sharing was really, the way that they described it in the reading was that they're basically constructing a language of sharing about like what their responsibilities are between men and women. So, they say that they're co-caring or co-providing. And so instead of, this person is doing this or this person is doing that they're both doing it. They're just doing it at different times and in ways depending on their availability. Okay, moving on to chapter 9. Okay, so women's increase in labor force participation, just the idea that in the next decade, 80% of new laborers are going to be women, minorities, and immigrants, like the places in which the economy is growing. That there's this assumption that men work harder hours or longer hours than women do. But when it comes to nationally and globally, this is just not the case, right? Statistics do not bear that out. Especially if you're looking internationally and you're looking at places in which women are expected to do a lot of like work that's like subsistence, like going and fetching water for hours a day. Emotion work. There's a lot of jobs, especially jobs that have a lot of, that have like a female connotation to them or have a lot of women in that field, often revolve around emotion work, which is when you're trying to make sure that male-to-male interactions go smoothly and remain unmistakably heterosexual. So, they talked about it in the chapter how the early versions of this, I mean, obviously we all do like emotion work nowadays, pretty much of like, how are you? How can I help you? All this kind of crap. But at the beginning, this started as like being a stewardess or being a waitress, or like a cocktail waitress or something like that, where you're wearing some skimpy thing and you're serving the male patrons of this particular place. It was really a way so that guys could like, I don't know, get dinner together and hang out all night and it not be considered homosexual, right? So a lot of those early kind of positions were framed out of that, right? Providing a very visible marker of gender difference in like a tiny cocktail waitress outfit or things like that. Let's see, subtle sexism. So this takes place in the world of work. In a lot of ways, like they talk about in that reading, like a whole bunch of different ways. Like the condescending chivalry was one of the examples where the boss is like, oh, I don't want to criticize you because it'll hurt your feelings, even though criticism in a work environment can be a positive thing so that you can improve your performance, right? Subjective objectification is another thing they talk about in that reading, which is just believing that all people at all, like all women or all men, fit some sort of stereotype. So this is kind of where that mommy track comes in, where oftentimes employers will assume a woman's going to be more focused on her children than her job, so they might not give her the same opportunities. There's also benevolent exploitation, where you give someone the opportunity to experience, basically like a new job classification or a new title or something else they can try. So basically, like, let's say you give someone a project, a woman a project, but then she does the work and you ultimately just take credit for it, right? That's kind of so common in the research that they literally have a name for it. And collegial exclusion, which is where you schedule meetings at times when parents have family responsibilities, right? Like the end of the day or sometimes on weekends or things like that. Really putting parents, whether they're male or female, in a bind, right? Where they then have to choose between their work and their home or their family. And again, this causes a lot of conflicts and problems where this could affect your retention, your promotion, all that kind of stuff. Okay, let's see, gender discrimination. Just that, when it comes to kind of intersectionality, there's more than gender discrimination obviously going on when it comes to our economy, but it's important to look at gender as an individual factor, but it's also important to look at how gender overlaps race, ethnicity, immigration status, all of those kind of things to affect, your sexual orientation, like all of those things to affect the way that you're treated within the world of work, right? And the more marginalized you are, typically, the worse experiences you have as far as discrimination in the workplace. Let's see. Sex segregation is just women's and men's concentration in different jobs or different occupations and different levels within those jobs, right? So there are some jobs that are considered like female dominated, like being a cashier or something. But often in those same jobs, the higher up you go in the hierarchy, the more men you find within those job ranks. Let's see. Wage gap. Again, just from your book, it's the differences in wages between men and women in society that are largely due to the kind of stereotypes that we have about who deserves what kind of value a worker has, how hard someone works, those kind of things. And really, we can talk about all day about the history and the cultural notions that have led to this point. But really, the wage gap is kind of the result of those inequalities in, we already talked about this in who gets hired and who gets promoted and who gets the better shift or the better hours or, all of those things. The glass ceiling. This is just the phenomenon where a lot of women are prevented from advancing to high pay levels or managerial positions, where basically they work in an industry and they move up a certain amount. They can be a low-level manager or a supervisor, but then they hit a wall. And they call it the glass ceiling because it's like this invisible barrier that says, you're not qualified to be a manager, right? And a lot of this just has to do with gendered perceptions of that person themselves, versus the glass cellar, which is the phenomenon where men are concentrated in a lot of really dangerous and hazardous occupations. And it's interesting, like the chapter talks about how there's a lot of industries that people will say, well, women shouldn't work in them because there's reproductive harm that could come for this. But they don't worry about men working in the same industries, even though, technically that's how biology works, is you need reproductive materials from both people for that to happen. And so we're not worrying about the health consequences for men. And there's this kind of paternalizing logic of, oh, we have to protect women, but why not men? Shouldn't we just protect workers from safety or health issues, right? Why should there be a gendered aspect there? So that's another issue. Sexual harassment, right? The idea that sexual harassment can be something that you experience just out in life. It can be something you experience in the workplace. And there's different kinds. There's quid pro quo, right? The reading talks about that. And there's what's called hostile work environment. So, some women experience sexual harassment, like the video I put in the PowerPoint for you of Jessica Williams talking about being catcalled on her way to work. That's a very common experience a lot of women have, especially from a very young age, like walking home in like junior high and having adult men whistle at them, which is like, ugh, you just want to shower after that. But of course, this could still be like the example I gave you of Anita Hill, the Anita Hill case, right? Where she experienced harassment from, Clarence Thomas, who's now a Supreme Court Justice for life. Yay. And that just some really egregious stuff that he did, and they did not consider it harassment, which is incredible. And then quid pro quo is like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of thing of like, if you, like, let's say sometimes it's like an offer of something, like if you have sex with a person, they'll promote you, or maybe they'll give you a more favorable whatever work situation. But sometimes it's the other way of like a threat, like if you don't sleep with this person or don't have some sort of sexual encounter with them, then they will not give you opportunities or access or those kind of things. This is kind of a lot of that Harvey Weinstein kind of Hollywood gatekeeper stuff of like, making women audition naked, all of these kind of horrible things, really exploitive things, often in a way to, again, kind of say, oh, I'll exchange this opportunity I have because I'm a gatekeeper and I can keep you out of this opportunity. So I'll give you the opportunity, but you have to do something for me, right? Which again is super toxic and gross. And then there's the hostile work environment situation where someone just makes the whole environment seem very uncomfortable. This is like the Gretchen Carlson / Roger Ailes / Bill O'Reilly Fox News kind of situation where, Roger Ailes was basically operating with impunity for over 20 years, sexually harassing people. So since he was the head of Fox News Corporation, or at least the Fox News part of the Fox Corporation, he was able to basically fill the house with other sexual harassers basically that also worked with impunity for a long time. Like the Bill O'Reilly stuff came to light. He had to pay a bunch of settlements, but it wasn't until much later that we found out just how prevalent that was. It was coworkers of his. Some of them were just guests on the show. Like, it was definitely a widespread problem, but it creates a culture of harassment where there's justifications made for the people that are actually harassing, right? Where oftentimes it just becomes a work environment that's very uncomfortable for people to be in, right? Just having to deal with this person, or sometimes it's not even like hitting on them or direct stuff like that. It's just like people making sexist jokes or racist jokes, or like, those kind of things of just having to deal with awful people, right? It can create this environment where you don't want to go to work. You don't want to deal with it. You don't want to be there. It causes a lot of stress and strain. And that's not something we should have to deal with psychologically by going to work, other than the fact that capitalism itself is that, right? Other than that. Okay, so FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, just all you need to know for this is that it was passed in 1993, and it gives you 12 weeks of unpaid leave, right? Nationally, not by state. Racializing the glass escalator. Just the idea that this is basically the answer to that question, the first one. Jobs are sex segregated, which creates different occupational experiences. That's basically what the question is saying. I don't know how to describe it any more than that. The glass escalator model is just arguing that men are perceived as competent, even if they're in a female-dominated field. They're considered to be more competent, so they often experience easier entry into higher status or higher pay positions, meaning it's like the opposite version of the glass ceiling, that for some, like let's say you're in a female concentrated job, again, like the cashier example, that some of the men that gravitate towards those jobs may be promoted up into, general manager, district manager, those kind of regional manager, those higher positions, often because, again, the people making those hiring decisions are themselves men. So it becomes a gatekeeping issue of you see others as you see yourself. So oftentimes people don't realize that they're reifying these inequalities, right? They're not like, I'm only going to hire a man, but for some reason they feel more comfortable with this one guy than all of the women for some reason, right? And so people often just don't examine their privileges or understand how their biases operate, right? So in a lot of ways this affects who gets promoted, right? Okay, so tokens, all I really want you to take away from that are, these are just people who are seen as different from the majority, and they're often stereotyped by the majority group, right? And they're often asked to like speak on behalf of the entire group, right? To represent everyone somehow, even though, that's a pretty terrible thing to put on anyone's shoulders. Be like, speak on behalf of your gender or your race or your class or your disability or anything, right? Any of those things, your sexuality. And that's very uncomfortable to put on someone, to be like, oh, you represent all, women or something like that. And you're like, no, unless you're Whitney Houston and you're every woman. But the rest of us aren't. And so it's very difficult to kind of call upon one person and put a lot of that weight on them. Like, well, and that's really how tokenism is used, right? That we say, oh, well, this one woman says it's okay to do this, so therefore women say it's okay to do this. And you're like, yeah, that's not how that works, right? And it can be very difficult if you are that token to get your voice heard and not be dismissed. Let's see. Gender racism just means that stereotypes about race are also grounded in images and beliefs about gender, right? So the way that this kind of works out in this reading, because it's from the Racializing the Glass Escalator reading, is how Black male nurses are considered, threatened. Well, Black men in general in the culture are considered threatening or hypersexual or these kind of things, violent. But so as a result of that, the men in the study, the Black male nurses, were really interpreted or understood in terms of their race and gender simultaneously, right? So it wasn't just about being Black, it's about being a Black man, right? And that's how this kind of intersectionality works, is to connect those different levels of, we can't separate how we understand race from how we understand gender, because we have a very different understanding of different groups based on gender, right? Like if we look at how we understand like the pan-ethnic category of Asian Americans, right? We have very different understandings of Asian American women than Asian American men, right? We have very gendered expectations about how they act, their sexuality, right? All of these kind of things. And that just shows how those things are so intricately connected. It's very difficult to separate. Okay, so going into chapter 10, that's literally the question. In 2012, the U.S. ranked 84th in the world. That's literally it. Okay, gender gap in voting just means that women are more likely to vote Democrat and men are more likely to vote Republican. And this really just reflects the fact that women tend to hold more liberal views than men when it comes to, political ideology, especially programs that support LGBTQ people or deal with racial inequality or poverty or families or things like that. So as a result of them being more supportive of social policies, that means they're more supportive of Democrats because that's who pushes more social policies. Masculinity and presidential elections. Obviously it plays a role, plays a strong role. Like, right, we talked about the William Henry Harrison, like he wouldn't even wear a coat because he wanted to be really manly, and he died as a result. So masculinity is kind of a hallmark of our presidential elections, even if the people running are not, like, even if there's not a woman in the race. So this idea that gender is an identity, but is also a set of processes, just means that gender is something it's external to us, but it's also internal, right? It's a way that we process how others treat us. And so gender relations are deeply embedded in the institutions and institutional logics of our society. So it's not just about it being a personal internalized identity or an externalized understanding of something. It's also how much the institutions themselves are imbued with gendered roles, gendered expectations, and that they just reinforce a lot of these gender inequalities. So what does it mean that the personal is political? This just means that, how we live our everyday life is affected by our gender differences and gender inequality, right? So this just means that, the kind of way that we live our lives, how we live is different because of this gender divide, right? So, that's obviously your experiences are going to set up your perspectives. So how you live really matters. Feminism, it's just obviously, like, definition wise, the belief in the political, social, and economic equality of all people, right? Pretty simple, straightforward, or otherwise known as the F word, right? Let's see. Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, and Michelle Obama, gender, race, and class on the campaign trail. Women in leadership positions, really, what I'm looking for there is that, there's often women, when they're in these roles, they're often perceived as doing something that should be male, right? So they're often kind of judged harshly against a male expectation. So they often have to perform at a higher level in which to just be respected. So this is kind of going into that gender role incongruency theory that says that when women are in leadership positions, that the public tends to see this negatively. They tend to see her actions as too masculine, and that becomes like, okay, you're failing at your gender. You might be a good leader, but you're not good at your gender. And so this is a problem for people to actually get elected. So it's interesting that they talk about in the chapter how Hillary became more human and popular was actually not because she's a legal educator or a lawyer or, a professional outside of her husband. It wasn't because she, in her position as First Lady, advocated for the rights of women and children, right? It was because her husband had an affair, and it was basically a humiliation. And she had to do, of course, at the time period, nowadays, people are like, why did she stay with him? It's like, it would have been political suicide in the 90s to get divorced, right? So, she basically became more palatable to people because they saw her as a victim. And that fit a lot easier into kind of a gendered narrative of how people could understand a woman in that kind of position. So that's interesting. Anyway, okay, so short answer essay questions. First one, how are the laws that restrict the rights of transgender people? Gender-based discrimination. What are some of the ways policies affect the transgender community? So part of this is just that idea that, again, we don't have national protections There are some states that have protections for gender identity, but largely there's protections for gender, for sexual orientation, even though some places don't have all like great enough protections for that either. There's still a lot of discrimination going on in the workplace, especially. And this is a problem because if there's nothing institutionalized to say that you can't be fired for being transgender, then obviously we talk about we're having this moment where people are becoming more aware of transgendered issues and becoming more progressive, but we still don't have national policies protecting them. And that's a problem, right? So you need to really kind of explain what are some of the ways that policies are affecting the transgender community. And again, this is coming from your book, but also just in general, how when we gender stratify something and say you have to be male or female, how those kind of policies affect what you can and can't do. Like if you need to, get documents of some kind, it's very difficult. So California itself just recently did this classification where a lot of government documents are now going to have a third option other than male and female. So that's kind of like one way that they're changing the structure of some of the policies that can actually, benefit people. So the problem too is that it's like an invisible community because you're not even, taking stats of these things previously. So how do you even understand like what problems they're facing? So really what I'm looking for here is just how are the laws restricting their rights, right? So, how is it that not giving people a space to kind of exist or not having national protections for workplace harassment or getting fired or things like that is a problem, right? Every group should be protected from these kind of like horrible discrimination tactics. So as far as what the ways policy affects the community itself, I need your opinion on that, right? What are some of the ways that these policies are going to have negative impacts, right? When we don't have worker protections and things like that. Okay, the second one is in regard to the film that we watched, Makers, Women in Politics. So what type of obstacles do American women face in finding opportunities in politics? I mean, they talk about this a lot in the film, so a lot of it is a funding-based issue or access-based issue, and again, a lot of it is gender discrimination, this idea that women are just not well suited for leadership positions, that men would be better suited for leadership positions. And they mention a few other examples that really make it, these are obstacles that are only based on gender, right? That there's obstacles for basically anyone getting into public office, but when it comes to the gendered issues, that's what I'm looking for. So when, reflecting on the film, thinking about what are some of the obstacles that women are facing just because of that gendered aspect. Okay, so this has been the review. Hopefully this is helpful.